November 30th, 2005. Boston traded Joe Thornton, their captain leading the NHL in scoring, to San Jose for Marco Sturm, Brad Stewart, and Wayne Primo. That same season, Thornton won the Hart Trophy in a different jersey. And it gets even worse, because Boston's GM was fired 4 months later. So why would Boston trade their captain, a guy putting up MVP numbers? Because on November 30th, 2005, the Bruins were a disaster. 8-13-5, dead last in the Northeast Division. They'd missed the playoffs in 2004. The post-lockout salary cap era had just begun, and Boston's front office was panicking. Enter Mike O'Connell, the GM who thought he could outsmart everyone. His plan? Trade Thornton now while his value was sky high, clear cap space, and rebuild around younger players. There was just one problem. Joe Thornton was leading the entire NHL in scoring. 33 points in 23 games. On pace for 117 points. He wasn't the problem. He was the only thing working. But O'Connell had his reasons. Thornton's 2003 playoff performance haunted him. Just 1 goal in 5 games against Ottawa. The narrative? Thornton couldn't perform in big moments. So on November 30th, O'Connell pulled the trigger. Joe Thornton to San Jose for Marco Sturm, Brad Stewart, and Wayne Primo. 3 solid players for 1 superstar. The return looked decent on paper. Marco Sturm, a 26-year-old winger with 20-goal upside. Brad Stewart, a 25-year-old defenseman, physical and reliable. Wayne Primo, a 30-year-old checking center. O'Connell sold it as a win-now move. More depth, more versatility, cap flexibility to sign Mark Savard, and eventually Zdeno Chara. And then it got worse. Thornton went to San Jose and exploded. 92 points in 58 games. 125 points total that season. Hart Trophy and Art Ross Trophy. Meanwhile, Boston finished 29-37-16, missed the playoffs again. If you've ever watched your team make a trade this catastrophic, hit that like button, because it gets even worse from here. Sturm, Stewart, and Primo combined for 88 points that season, less than Thornton had by himself. 4 months later, on March 25, 2006, Mike O'Connell was fired. His win-now trade had become the worst decision in franchise history. The disaster didn't end there. Because those 3 players Boston got, they became the foundation of a trade tree that would haunt the Bruins for years. Let's break down what happened to every single one of them. Marco Sturm was supposed to be the goal scorer Boston desperately needed. 26 years old, coming off a 29-goal season. His best year in Boston? 27 goals, 56 points in 2007 to 2008. The problem? Joe Thornton had 96 points that same season. Sturm played 302 games for Boston over 5 seasons. 106 goals, 87 assists, 193 points total. Then in 2010, they traded him to LA for future considerations. Future considerations. That's what the centerpiece became. Now let's talk about Brad Stewart, the defenseman who was supposed to anchor Boston's blue line. Stewart played parts of 2 seasons in Boston. 48 points in 103 games. Physical, reliable, everything O'Connell promised. And Wayne Primo? The veteran checking center who was supposed to bring leadership, he played 101 games for Boston. 15 points in his final season. But on February 10th, 2007, just 14 months after acquiring him, Boston traded Stewart and Wayne Primo to Calgary for Andrew Ference and Chuck Kobasu. Why? Because Stewart was about to become an unrestricted free agent, and Boston knew they couldn't afford to re-sign him, so they flipped him for 2 cheaper players. The real twist? Brad Stewart went on to win a Stanley Cup with Detroit in 2008. Meanwhile, Boston was still trying to figure out what went wrong. Combined, these 3 players gave Boston 506 games. Joe Thornton played 1,104 games for San Jose. The disaster seemed complete, but then something unexpected happened. The 2 players Boston got back from Calgary, Andrew Ference and Chuck Kobasu, actually became valuable pieces. Chuck Kobasu delivered exactly what Boston needed. 158 games, 84 points over 4 seasons. Now here's where it gets interesting. because Boston flipped him into two players who would lift the Stanley Cup in 2011. Then, in October 2009, Boston flipped him to Minnesota for Craig Weller, Alexander Falstrom's rights, and a 2011 second-round pick. That second-round pick, Boston used it to draft Alexander Kuklachev, 45th overall in 2011. Kuklachev played 9 games for Boston, 0 points. So much for extracting value from this mess. But here's the twist. Boston also got Craig Weller in that deal, who they immediately flipped, along with Byron Bitts and a 2010 second-rounder, to Florida for Dennis Seidenberg and Matt Bartkowski. And Seidenberg, he became a top 4 defenseman on Boston's 2011 Cup team, 25 playoff games, reliable shutdown minutes. But here's what made Seidenberg valuable. He was the defensive anchor Boston needed. During the 2011 playoff run, he averaged 22 minutes per game, second among Bruins defensemen behind only Zdeno Chara. He blocked shots, he killed penalties, he played through injuries. In the Cup final against Vancouver, Seidenberg was on the ice for critical defensive zone faceoffs. Game 7? He logged 24 minutes of ice time in the biggest game of his career. Seidenberg wasn't a star. He wasn't putting up points. But he was exactly what championship teams need. A reliable, stay-at-home defenseman who does the dirty work. He played 4 more seasons in Boston after winning the Cup, 401 games total as a Bruin, a legitimate contributor to their championship core. So that's one player from this disaster who actually delivered. But here's what most people don't know. There was a second contributor from this trade tree. Andrew Ference, a different story. 3 goals, 12 assists in 70 games during the 2010-11 season. But he brought something Boston desperately needed: leadership. He was the voice in the locker room. And on June 15th, 2011, 6 years after the Thornton trade, Dennis Seidenberg and Andrew Ference hoisted the Stanley Cup as a Boston Bruin. Think about that. Players acquired in a panic trade to salvage the worst deal in franchise history became part of Boston's first championship team in 39 years. Ference played 373 games for Boston over 7 seasons. Then on July 5th, 2013, he signed with Edmonton as a free agent. So let's answer the question. Was this the worst trade in Bruins history? Yes. Boston traded a 125-point Hart Trophy winner in his prime, a generational playmaker, for 3 players who combined for 506 games. Marco Sturm became future considerations. Brad Stewart was flipped after 1 season. Wayne Primo lasted 101 games. The salvage operation? Seidenberg and Ference both contributed to Boston's 2011 Cup. That's real. That matters. But the core of that championship was Zdeno Chara, Patrice Bergeron, and Tim Thomas. Seidenberg and Ference were depth pieces. Meanwhile, Joe Thornton became a franchise icon. 1,104 games with San Jose, 804 assists, number retired in 2024. 2 role players winning a cup doesn't erase trading away a Hall of Famer in his prime. That's why this is the worst trade in Bruins history. Mike O'Connell was fired 115 days after making the trade. Joe Thornton played 18 more seasons after leaving Boston. And the Bruins spent years trying to undo the damage. That's the legacy of November 30th, 2005. The day Boston traded away their captain, their best player, and their future. That was the Joe Thornton trade disaster. But it's not the only time a franchise destroyed their future in one move. Think the Thornton trade was bad? The Erik Karlsson disaster destroyed an entire franchise. Check out that video next. Or hit our worst trades playlist to see every catastrophic deal that changed NHL history. And if you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe. We drop new trade disasters every week.